Well, I can say this with unmitigated certainty. You never know what you're gonna get, as in there is no such thing as certainty. Because when the first of the ships entered our atmosphere, most everybody was scared shitless. This massive ship, at least the size of Manhattan or better, was floating down towards Europe, of all places. We wanted to know what the hell was going on. This strange, oblong shape wasn't triangular, it wasn't rectangular, it wasn't a box, it wasn't a cube, it wasn't a sphere. I couldn't quite really tell you, except that it looked a lot like it had slanted edges, very similar to our B1s. But I don't know what else to say besides that. No external engines or anything like that, but every single military on the planet was immediately brought up to ready status as fast as they could, and I can't say I blame them. If you're facing a species you know nothing about, and one that just showed up unannounced, it'd be like some stranger just walking into your house. You don't know what their intentions are. To our absolute surprise, this thing stopped about a quarter mile above the surface and just hung there for a minute. Several fighter aircraft just did circles around it over and over and over again as other equipment was moved into location so that they could bring their barrels up and bring all weapons to bear in case these, whatever in the hell they were, got froggy and jumped. What we didn't know was they were simply waiting on their friends to show up. Others came down across the planet, some in the middle of cities, others in the middle of residential and rural areas. They just wanted to just kind of show up and hung out there. Eventually, over 40 of these craft were all over the planet, and one of them was in my hometown. And I was getting ready to crap myself. If this thing started firing, I didn't have anything to fire back with. I'm pretty sure any weapons on something this big could probably eviscerate my house in one shot. To our absolute surprise, they sent out a communication. A simple word. Hello. It was in every single language on the planet at the same time. We responded back, of course, and eventually they lowered their ships and landed. It was a surprise. They had not sent any type of video, only audio. I don't know why, but it seemed to be almost, well, for lack of a better term, snooty in the way they were doing things. Like they were looking at us as lower beings or something like that, which maybe for some areas of the world might not be such a big deal, but over here, yeah, we already didn't have a good feeling about these folks. To our absolute shock, when they landed, they lowered some landing struts and landed almost silently, and then opened up a doorway we didn't even know was there. And as the hatch opened up, it slowly lowered a ramp, and we saw the aliens for the first time. They looked like, well, moose. Anthropomorphic, of course. They still had the moose-type feet. For those outside of this continent, it's kind of like camels, actually. Now that I think about it, they kind of mixed the two, as the head wasn't nearly as big as a moose, and their horns were not nearly as grandiose. In fact, they only stuck out a little bit, and these were obviously the males. The females were much sleeker and much smaller, and seemed to be very subdued. They didn't even raise their heads, and kept their hands, their four-fingered hands, tucked down in front of them as they walked down. To my absolute surprise, as I stood there, I'm looking at these things in almost human attire. They seemed to be almost like they were wearing a suit. At least the men were. The women were in some strange-looking dress type of deal. I guess that's a commonplace thing, or maybe they were just trying to play nice. They went up, and I listened to them talk to the mayor of the town. The mayor just about shitting himself as he was so scared to look up at this 9.5-foot thing as it just spoke down to him. Eventually, they all walked around, and many people showed up to give them gifts and kind of a way to say hello. To our surprise, these moose tracks, I guess you'd say, brought gifts as well. They said they had brought technology to help us expand our species. I looked to see what it was, and I asked, specifically to one of the females, what was it? She looked shy and turned away. I guess it's part of their culture. One of the males immediately came in and told me what it was. The translator he had was garbled for a moment, and then he simply said, "Quantum generator." "Oh, that's interesting. What frequency do you have it on?" And his ears immediately perked straight up in the air. He was confused. "How do you know what this is? Your technology is not even... How?" "Well, that's easy, my friend." And I simply began to explain how very, very smart men have been able to have their notes put out on our internet. They didn't even know what an internet was. It's not part of their culture to spread knowledge to each other like that. Knowledge is kept to a small group. They were absolutely astounded at this, as they realized that they might have just come across a culture with 7+ billion that may all have the potential of understanding the technology that they're holding. Even though to them this was nothing. This was like showing an internal combustion engine to someone who's already mastered fusion. It's just simple. That being said, eventually we sat down and talked. The man who jumped in front of me, well, man, male, however you want to put it, I have trouble pronouncing his name as the translators themselves would not alter the name itself. I just ended up calling him, well, Larry. That's as close as I could get. I cannot switch my tongue. The closest I get is Lahananithere. Okay, Larry was good enough. He also butchered my name, but I didn't think of it too much. Eventually, I actually invited him back to my house. And even though he had trouble getting in the door, we enjoyed a cup of coffee. He was surprised at this, and they had a type of beverage that was very similar, but he said ours was much, much richer. I asked him if it was similar to tea. He didn't know what the hell I was talking about. I went and showed him how it was made. His wife was very interested on how the different type of cuisines were made. They asked if this was a delicacy, and I had to explain that no, this is just a commonplace thing. As they sipped the black tea I find to be, well, slightly sweeter and have a much better flavor. They were amazed that it was so similar to what they had on their own planet. But that was only the beginning of the surprises. He showed me how to hook up the generator into my own house. The dang thing's not barely the size of a microwave, and now my house is 100% energy independent. Boy, that's gonna piss off everybody at Eveready, that's for sure. And Duracell can kiss my ass. He looked at me sideways as he looked over towards my posterior. "No, I don't mean literally they can kiss my ass. Never mind, it's a slang term." He again looked confused. Odd idioms that mean something else, metaphoric. That he understood as it translated perfectly. Both of them seemed surprised when we came back up and I said, "It's about time for lunch. What are you guys in the mood for?" Without hesitation, they mentioned that they were all herbivores, which shouldn't have surprised me in the slightest considering their exterior. But I asked exactly what type of food they would like. They simply stated, "Surprise me." His wife even looked at me for the first time in the eyes and nodded up and down. I said, "Well, how about you come out to the garden? I mean, a lot of things are ripe. You can come and pick your own if you want." "Garden? You grow your own food? Is everyone like this?" No, not really. And I had to explain everything on the way down to the garden itself. Thankfully, being in the middle to late summer, most everything was coming up ripe. I went in, grabbed some green beans, had some cucumbers, and was able to find a really good zucchini to chop off. Unfortunately, things like the corn and the potatoes weren't ready yet, but I was also able to grab some tomatoes and things of that nature. Although I really think they would have enjoyed the gourds, pumpkins and stuff like that, it just wasn't ready. I had to explain this to them. Apparently, they have a completely different growing cycle on their planet, and they were amazed at this, and eventually we went inside. I gave them some beans to start off with to just see how they liked them. being their size, I had to give them a full handful, would be like me eating two at once. And the look on their faces as sheer shock as they took one bite. And when I say they, I mean he took a bite. And his eyes got really wide and his ears once again shot into the air. And he slowly chewed. I thought for a second, oh shit, I poisoned him. Oh crap, interstellar war. I just poisoned an ambassador. Oh shit. Oh, I'm fucked. He looked down at the beans and then shoved them all in his mouth and just was all I heard. He looked over to his wife and nodded slightly, and she simply started chewing on the beans as well, and she just rolled her eyes almost in pleasure, as in extemporaneous pleasure, as she chewed onto them. It's like, oh, you don't have anything like this where you come from? Our foodstuffs are not this palatable or flavorful. This is extreme. Oh, we need to get some of these. These are wonderful. So you think that's good? Give it a minute. I brought everything inside, well, inside to cut it up, that is. Everybody else was waiting on the back porch, and we had kind of a little picnic. I threw together what little bit I could, considering we're looking at complete vegetarian here. I had to explain to them that humans are omnivorous. Thankfully, they already understood this and realized that if we had meat, it wasn't meant to be an insult, although a little scary for their kind, as at one point they had been hunted down for their meat by a separate species. But that species was actually small. When they showed a display of them and displayed it next to a human, it turned out they only came up to just over my waist. Barely 3.5 feet tall were they. Turns out they went when these folks were, primitive, and started to take over the planet and hunted them down, and eventually they were able to fight back and reverse engineer, or however the way they engineered the new technology, so that they could defend themselves. And since then, they have become explorers, looking out amongst the stars. And we are grateful for this. As I brought everything out, our ambassador started to ask the different foodstuffs that was there. One of the things that kind of made him turn sideways was the cucumbers. These straight eights looked honestly like, well, a green turd to them. I simply looked over to him and handed a plate where the cucumbers had been peeled and sliced. I said, they taste better with a little salt, but why don't you try them straight first? With that, he did take a little time trying to get his very large digits to pick up a single piece. He looked, sniffed, and his ears went up again. Then he slowly put it in his mouth, and with the first crunch, his eyes simply rolled into the back of his head, and you just hear, I hope that's a good sound, was the only thing going through my head. And with that, he foregoed with the rest of his fingers and the rest of his manners, and simply dove his face onto the plate. I handed a plate over to his spouse, and she began to chomp down on him as well, with the same insane vigor. With that, I showed them the different zucchini and things like that, and told them that these are only ripe for a short time of the year. They were worried for a second if they were like the cucumber themselves, as they had already grabbed a fully unpeeled cucumber, shoved it in the mouth, and snapped it in half, and this seemed to be an extreme delight to them. I was surprised. Cucumbers don't have much flavor, and they're not exactly calorically dense by a long shot, and yet these folks seem to find the flavor, well, exotic and exuberating, and a few other words which I don't think are kid-friendly. With that, eventually they dove into the zucchini and had the same, if not similar, effect. And it was just something else to see. As we finished up, I went and got a few extra, basically picked the whole place clean, just to give them something to bring back to their friends. With that, we headed back towards the town green, and there several others were still standing around trying to explain the different ways that they could free them from the energy grid and how the different frequencies would actually help the human race. More on that later, perhaps, but for right now, it was just something else to see the extreme difficulty that both the husband and wife had as they tried not to dive into the vegetables as they brought the bag full to their friends, immediately walking up to the one in charge and almost throwing the bag in his chest, stating something in their own language, which I'm guessing was, "You have to try this." With that, he simply reached in, not looking, saying something else in their language, and pulled out a cucumber. The look of disgust on his face was definitely noticeable, no matter what. The ears had also dropped again, another telltale sign that he was disgusted at the sight of this. Then he said something in his own language and took the cucumber and whacked it on the man's nose. I'm guessing that's some sort of sign of disrespect. With that, they seemed to argue over it, and eventually the husband reached out, grabbed the cucumber, and bit it in half right in front of him. And again, his ears perked up and then rolled back to the back of his head, almost laying flat, and his eyes rolled up into his head. And you just heard that same... Jeez, dude, you gotta change your pants? What the hell is going on? With that, the one in charge took the other half of the cucumber and bit into it, just a little bit, and then, without a second's hesitation, shoved the whole thing into his mouth. He looked over and was surprised. What in the ever-loving crap? The husband pointed at me, and so did the wife. Apparently they were asked who gave them this. The leader walked up and asked me, "How did you grow such wonderful foodstuffs?" This is common food here. Am I assuming that this is going to be something that's going to make sure that there's no problems between your species and mine? With that, he looked and seemed to almost smile, although I really don't know what his species' version of a smile was. But he did seem to chuckle, a kind of hoarse... I didn't understand that, as it sounded like he was trying to sneeze, cough, and fart at the same time. With that, he took that massive hand of his, placed it on my shoulder, and simply stated, "No, we did not come here for that, although it was an option. However, if you continue to make foodstuffs like this, I guarantee that my species will become your best friends." I looked up and grinned slightly, not realizing that showing my teeth might be something that they find dangerous, and simply stated, "Oh, you like cucumbers? Jeez, I can't wait to see your face until you guys try pickles."